Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Sano Genetics webinar on decentralized clinical trials. I'm very fortunate today to be joined by a couple of leading experts in the field, my friends and colleagues, Craig Lipset and Liam Eves, who have incredibly impressive backgrounds, which we'll let them speak to in just a sec. But just in terms of housekeeping, today we are planning to have a session around 45 minutes. We actually have a pre-populated list of evil questions that I've been carefully crowdsourcing from the meanest people on the internet to challenge Craig and Liam with. But we'll certainly make time at the end for questions. So there's a Q&A functionality down the bottom on Zoom. So please do use that, and we'll field your questions anonymously. So don't feel worried we're going to read out your names or anything like that. This session will be recorded, so you'll be able to come back to this later on if you'd like to, or share with colleagues once you've registered. And then finally, if you do have any technical problems, as my colleague has just said in the chat, please click there and someone will come out to you and we'll try and get you up and running. So without further ado, we'll get started. So thanks again so much for joining us. My name's Paul Wicks. I'm a neuropsychologist by training, and I first got into this concept of decentralized trials about 12 or 13 years ago, sort of by chance, when a company where I was working, Patients Like Me, suddenly identified over 100 patients had gone off and almost designed their own trial over the internet and had started taking medications off label. And so we as a science team were trying to figure out, well, could we actually use this as an opportunity to compare this group of self-selecting volunteers to a placebo group that's the sort of a natural history observational study. And this was quite new and controversial around 2008 when it was happening. And as we sort of explored the field, we noticed there were only one or two people really involved in this space, and one of them was Craig Lipset. So I'll be sort of moderating today, but really these two folk are the experts. So Craig, do you want to tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into the wonderful world of decentralization?
Hey, thanks, Paul. It is great to see you. It's great to be here with Liam. And by the way, just as far as your intro, how are we going to celebrate and reward the attendee with the harshest, most challenging question if we're ensuring anonymity? I hope we can tokenize these questions and, in a privacy-preserving way, link back to some of those people who come up with that real stumper for Liam.
Humdinger. I think this will be called the Reviewer 2 prize, because that's always who gets you out in publications and grants, isn't it? Reviewer 2. So we're looking for our Reviewer 2.
Well, it is great to be here with you. As you mentioned, I've been around this clinical trial space for a bit. I was most recently the head of clinical innovation at Pfizer. I spent about a dozen years there, including the opportunity to help design and lead the industry's first fully decentralized clinical trial, which we affectionately coined as the Pfizer remote trial. Much of my journey down developing that model at Pfizer back then was based on my own experiences as a patient with a rare lung condition. As I got deeper and more engaged with the e-patient community and started to have this greater appreciation for the role of the highly engaged e-patient that then intersects with a clinical trial and becomes, I guess, an e-participant in the process. Today, I serve as an advisor, a board member, an educator. I teach at Rutgers in health informatics and guest lecture at the University of Rochester. I serve on the boards for organizations like the Decentralized Trials and Research Alliance, DTRA, which I co-founded. DTRA is a global nonprofit collaboration with about 130 organizations as members working together to ease the global adoption of decentralized research. I'm also the vice chair of the board for the MedStar Health Research Institute, which is a 12-hospital system in the Mid-Atlantic, and the vice president at the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research, a nonprofit patient organization that is personal to both me and my lungs. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today, Paul.
Great. Thanks, Craig. I like lungs as well. I've currently jerry-rigged my own rehabilitation process post-COVID, and so we must exchange notes on respiratory training devices and how not to get dribble all over yourself whilst you're doing so. So brilliant. And then Liam, why don't you say a little bit about yourself and how you've become involved in this field?
hard to follow Craig's introduction, but again, it's great to be chatting with both of you. So I spent the last 15 years essentially designing solutions for how do we speed up enrollment within clinical trials, primarily looking at solutions from both a site perspective, but I've got a keen interest in keeping a lot of these solutions very patient-centric, and I think that's where obviously these decentralized trials fit into play. Been working at Sano now as VP of ClinOps in the last for the last 2 years, and essentially looking at how we can bring this decentralized model to the genetic screening of patients for precision medicine.
That's great, thank you. And I suppose, given in mind we sort of know who the attendees are, I know many of the people listening are themselves experts in decentralized trials, but just for the sake of those who might be newer to it, I wonder if, Liam, you might give us a little bit of a definition or how you see the difference between what most people may think of as a traditional clinical trial, and I guess what's the spectrum look like in terms of, well, how do you know when something is decentralized?
Yeah, sure. I think there's I think that this, to your point, Paul, I think there's a scale of this, right, in the sense that a traditional site is or a traditional trial is more when individuals are going to research centers, to hospitals and so on and so forth to take part in clinical trials. Whereas going to the other side of that is actually how do we keep patients at home and still be able to study them. I think that there is a hybrid in there as well, right, in which there's some mix of traditional and also remote trials. But I think Craig, when we spoke in the past, it probably sums it up best. I don't know if you want to give your take on that, Craig.
I would say that decentralized trials are really just a collection of tools and methods. They are a collection of technologies and processes that, when applied, can create options for people to participate in research outside of a traditional research site. And those technologies are known, whether it's e-consent, electronic diaries, video visits, their process changes like home visits, or the enabling of local specimen acquisition, local image acquisition, extending our drug supply chain for people in the home. And whether it's in the home, whether it's retail pharmacy, pop-up and mobile clinics, local doctors' offices, there's a wide universe of emerging locations, but those locations need to be driven by the patient, by the participant, so that we're meeting them where it's right for them. We shouldn't be aiming to close certain doors just to open others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if the traditional model was please come to the hospital once a month, every month, and when you're there, you might get a blood test, you might get a brain scan, but you might just have a chat with the doctor and fill out a questionnaire. I think we'll have had a lot of experiences where patients themselves, participants, may have said, well, that's not really a good use of my time. Couldn't we have done this on the phone? And I know, myself, I'm a caregiver for a family member with motor neuron disease. Getting someone to clinic involves, in our family, 7 people's schedules having to align and, pondering down the motorway and finding a parking space and finding a disabled badge and all the rest of it. So it's a lot, right? So, I guess on one level, one of my questions would be, how come it's taken us this long, to get there? We've got rockets that can go into space and then land on a platform by themselves. How come it's taken us this long to, start incorporating this practice, do you think, in clinical research?
Well, I mean, it's certainly one of these silver linings of the tragedy of the last 2 years in terms of creating and harnessing that sense of urgency, because the ability to use these tools and methods was never hampered or limited by regulations. Regulators around the world care about 2 guardrails: ensuring patient safety and ensuring data integrity. But there's always been plenty of room to operate in between. The question is, has this been a priority given all of the other challenges, given all the other things that were needed? Some might say people come into clinics and they're coming into clinics, so it's therefore not our biggest priority. Now that we've navigated through the pandemic and these decentralized tools became critical countermeasures for business continuity during the lockdowns, now we know that we can. We've done it. We've We've done it once, we've done it twice, we can do it again. And so the barriers to entry, the inertia has been addressed. The question is, do people have the commitment to experience, to access, to diversity, to continue to support these approaches? And if not doing it for the patient, at least doing it for business continuity going forward. Because I don't know if there's a COVID-24, fires, murder hornets, war in Eastern Europe, whatever the other issue is that's going to prevent a patient from getting to a clinic. Business continuity risks being disrupted around conducting these studies and ensuring that we can follow people for safety and efficacy. And so even if doing it just for selfish reasons, to make sure that we're doing this.
Yeah. So it makes sense to me, right? If I was a participant in a clinical trial, I love this idea that it's sort of coming out to me. But I guess, Liam, I'm curious, I know you've done a lot of work with sites, and maybe it's worth just spending a second or two when we say, do we always mean hospitals, or what do we mean, or renting out trailers and car parks? What is this? Can you say a little bit about their experience? Because presumably they have a 70, 100-year tradition of doing research in a particular way. Are they as enthusiastic from their side?
Yeah, I think it's you get a mixture, right? Like with anything, and changes, it can be scary, it can be great, and I think it's where you sort of fit within that. I think that what's interesting with a lot of these sites is that you do get a mixed bag, right? So for a lot of people, I've seen reports out there, there's around 50% confidence for sites to actually be running more of, again, to that scale, which is important, a hybrid, more hybrid than anything. So we get about 50% confidence at sites being able to actually operate their own, sites in a DCT manner. I think that what's interesting is that a lot of sites recognize that it is the way forward. Whether it's completely remote or hybrid, I think that it seems to be still a bit of a black box in terms of what is this, how does it all work, and how does it all tie together. And I think that there's like a real there's a few considerations that we need to be taken with sites, because they need to be an active part of this, which is some things like some of the comments that I've heard are a lot of sites are not getting paid for all work related to the actual DCT, right? So line items such as things like taking the time to support patients, the training of these patients, and so on and so forth, are sometimes not considered. The technical implementation of it. So we know that there's a lot of, on average, each site are operating around 5 tools per study. When you start to throw these things in, and I know, Craig, you've spoken about this before, about this concept of, bring your own device for sites, in which that the sites are able to then, operate their own devices and things like that. That just gives that level of familiarity. So I think that things around actually understanding the sites and how they operate in, making sure that they're compensated for the work, ensuring that there's technical support, like, technology goes down, the sites are not necessarily the technology experts, and so on and so forth, but patients will still, communicate to the site because that's who they've got their relationship with. And some sort of tech site support around that is important. But I think that in general, I think that the sites recognize that this is a good thing. I think it's that change that is hard. And I think it's also ensuring that we're compensating them appropriately.
Yeah.
I think those are some really critical themes Liam is raising. I almost compartmentalize some of the conversation into site concerns around technology, around oversight, and around economics. So the technology today, we are slamming study-specific technology down on sites harder than we ever have before. And we've done that to sites for a very long time. But we're forgetting that there are many sites that provide clinical care. And if you provide clinical care, you had a platform for video. It's how you kept your doors open for 2 years. If you are a site that does any research on your own, you probably have a platform for e-consent. You have many of these tools in-house. And so what we tend to see is, if you are, say, an academic institution and 50% of your studies are academic, site-initiated, grant-funded, they're using their own tools and technology and process. And then for the other 50% of studies that are pharma-sponsored, they're getting thrown at with unfamiliar technology. And Pharma and CROs do this, believing that this creates control, that for the unit of my study, all of my sites are consistent and therefore quality is better. But when we look at it through the unit of the site, it is chaos. There is no quality by design. There's no opportunity for sites to leverage training and investment. And so as Liam hit at, we need to start to shift our focus to enabling sites to bring their own technology when they have, and just to provision some of these decentralized tech when they don't have it. And the way we'll do that is through standards. We have to make sure that oversight is being managed. You know, the investigator has medical, clinical, legal obligations as it relates to oversight for the participant in the trial. And if we're hiring a bunch of third parties to do nursing visits, to do other activities, how does the investigator maintain their obligations? Some sponsors are getting very aggressive, insisting that their sites are signing delegations of authority to these third parties, but that oversight is on them. Will sites start to develop their own visiting nurse capabilities to be able to control that process better? And as Liam hit on, the freakonomics of clinical research aren't a mystery. Economic incentives drive behavior. Here's a fun fact. A couple of years back, in the last company, we had an Alzheimer's clinical trial. We had retained a visiting nurse service, and we developed a plan that for every other visit, the visit could be spared and the patient could be seen at home, knowing, as you said, Paul, earlier, that caregivers were significantly impacted transporting loved ones for site visits. So the fun fact is, how many home visits did we do for that trial? And you could say, I didn't give you anywhere near enough information to estimate that, but it doesn't matter. The answer is 0. And the answer is 0 because our proposal was the budget for that visit was getting diverted from the site to a third-party visiting nurse service. So why would a site feel comfortable with this? Why would they embrace this? We marginalize them, we box them out. This option was never presented for patients in the first place. And so we have to think about, how do we keep our sites whole financially, keep them engaged as for the important role that the investigator is playing in the process?
So it sounds like for all the benefits that we've spoken about, when it all works well, there's massive workforce changes and culture changes that are inherent in this transformation, right? It's like the shift to online banking or grocery delivery or something like that. It's not just about the app that you see, it's about, you know, all the shift changes and the workforce changes, and, you know, it means that branches are going to close on your high street or whatever it is, you know, that's kind of there. I guess one of the questions I had was around maybe to your point about the economics of this. So at least in my limited experience, we would often see that clinical centers, say specialist academic centers in some of these very specialist and rare diseases, they often didn't have enough money to provide the clinical care. And to some extent, the research funding was like the way to either top up or even make possible specialist centers in, you know, awful, horrible diseases that you don't want to have. But presumably, and we would see a lot of those stuff would be, oh, well, I've got a research fellow and half their time is funded by being on this trial, or, you know, now I've got these research nurses, but actually they can also do some of the clinical visits and coordinate care and whatever. If those people all become decentralized DAO NFTs in the cloud, who's going to deliver my care? Is that one of the issues that people are really facing, or is that just a could be?
Decentralized trials are not the end of the investigator site. I think that the expectation that decentralization is going to destroy the research practices as we know it is an extreme lens that is not happening in the near term. Why is that not happening? Because most organizations that are planning and designing these studies stop and talk to and listen to patients when they're planning and designing. Shocking, right, Paul? But what happens when you, right? What happens when you listen to patients around their preference for how they want to participate? I've had the opportunity to talk to patients about decentralization for over a decade. I've yet to meet patients who tell me, I wish I could never go to a site again. If only there was a way to take that option away from me, right? That's like me saying, I don't ever want to see a supermarket again. I only want home delivery. And while you're at it, shut down all the restaurants. I only want my meals delivered to me at home. Sometimes we want to go out. Sometimes we want that FaceTime with our doctor. It makes us feel good. Our connection with them, that still matters for patients. When we look at the experience ratings of patients who have site visits, it is overwhelmingly positive. The problem we are trying to fix is not that patients do not like their investigators and they will do anything to avoid them. The problem is exactly what Paul opened with. They can't get there. It is a burdensome matter to travel that distance, to take the time off from work, all of the caregiving and child support needs that start to click in, all of the other socioeconomic factors, personal hardship factors or otherwise. That's what's driving and represents a barrier for so many. That's what we can fix by creating options and choice for people. If we're going to create options and choice, it means we have to have different options available. If we close or lose our investigator site infrastructure, we're taking an option away from people that they want to have available to them.
I think that's a really good point, Greg, because it's about, I think it's allowing people to choose their own journeys, right? And ultimately, by giving people that flexibility, the patients that flexibility, that's what we're seeking for. It's, or designing, or should be designing for. So, to Craig's point is that, if you've got an individual who actually is still working, the flexibility of not having to go to those sites at every visit may be a blessing, because they can pick up the, a call and so on and so forth. Whereas someone who's perhaps older, who has a bit more time and so on and so forth, and live closer to a site, that may be easy for them to gain. So I think that, my view around this is that ultimately it should be patients that are driving their journey. And then it's how, as again, to Craig's point, is around, particularly around the economics of it, is sites should be paid for the level of service that they're giving in all aspects, and supporting those patients throughout. So yeah.
Well, it sounds like what you're talking about is kind of a load balancing scheme, right? That was somewhat customized to the site. So, I haven't had the pleasure of driving to, a hospital in Utah, but I see the 7-lane superhighways and, a lot of flat land. And I think it's probably easier to get a spot there than in MGH, right? Which is like impossible, especially if you get stuck on Storrow Drive. But perhaps there are site-specific issues and patient-specific issues, like you say, about, well, there are some people who can get the contact time. I know when I was at King's in South London, working in Parkinson's disease, it used to drive me crazy that the train station had, 100 steps and no lift, and there was no car park. And so we were constantly asking these people with a movement disorder to come and see us for trials. Please take public transport. Please keep your receipts. And then lo and behold, the people that took part are an unrepresentative sample, right? So, yeah, but so, I mean, maybe.
But I like the way you're describing that, Paul, in terms of load balance, because for years I would have people say to me, this model will work for low intensive dermatology, topical applications in phase 4. And we'd say, well, why not that person with a movement disorder? Why not that person in oncology? These are the people that need barriers and burden to be lifted. And to your point, we're not bringing that brain scan to the patient's house. Maybe in the future we will, but I don't think anybody is saying we're trucking an MRI to every patient's house. I think what we're saying is there are a dozen MRIs between my house and the one at Mass General, or King's College, or anywhere, right? So how do you let me use resources that are closer to me, that are more accessible to me, whether for specimen acquisition and other artifacts, whether biospecimen imaging or otherwise? There will be some things that are highly specialized that require me to come in. If I'm having a biopsy that's specific to the study, something unique in terms of an image acquisition, I'm coming in. But even then, maybe I'm coming in once rather than every month.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, I have been involved a little bit in some protocol development, and it often seems that they're the perfect is the enemy of the good, and that when you're in the room and you've seen, say, a bunch of animal data with extremely well-controlled circumstances, you're almost trying to just bring that across and say, well, if everybody, religiously showed up perfectly, this is what we'd love to do for both our primary endpoint and 58 science fair projects that we also want to tack onto this thing. But I guess the feedback that they're not getting is, well, who's going to be able to stay the course, and how much missing data will you have? One of the neat things SurveyMonkey does, if you want to code a survey in SurveyMonkey, is once you start making it too long, it'll go, hey, no one's going to answer this. Take it out. The protocols are developed in Word documents around committees with lots of scientists throwing in their pet projects. Oh, what about, neutrophils? And so there doesn't seem to be a feedback mechanism where we could understand and really shape, the interplay between the scientific question, the resources, the clinical side, the patient side. So, yeah, have you seen any approaches that make some progress there, or that really integrate those things, or is that sort of someone on the call's got to make this their next startup and go get a bunch of VC money to solve that?
I think that protocol design and development is having an incredible renaissance right now, and it's largely driven by these two complementary pressures inside of most organizations. We see it in all the rhetoric around most every life sciences company. We're patient-centric and we're data scientists. Sometimes those two messages seem in conflict with one another, but they do somewhat converge when we're thinking about study design, because organizations are being challenged to actively engage with and listen to patients during that design stage, and they're being challenged to make use of a wide range of diverse data in the design, feasibility, site selection, and recruitment strategy processes. That cluster in DevOps is like your pseudo data science microorganization, right? Study design, feasibility, site selection, and recruitment planning make use of your diverse external data, claims, intelligence, real world data, site insights, patient insights, and the list goes on and on. Now, there are some cool and emerging tools that are helping there. For some organizations, it's still, let's hire a bunch of people to scrape lots of data and produce slide decks for me that I can either embrace or ignore. And for other organizations, it's then a question of, can I have a more intelligent platform that can automate much of this? What we don't see yet, though, Paul, is I think the organizational culture shift yet, the switch from opting out to opting in, right? The idea that you can bring me your data and insights, but as a studied team, I can still pick and choose if I feel like following your data and insights or following my own instinct and gestalt. We have to mature these organizational approaches to a place where we're following the data. And if you're making a decision not to follow the data, you should be defending that decision rather than getting to choose if you're going to listen to what the data is telling you.
It's an interesting one as well, because on that point is that we, I think that culturally, as you mentioned, Craig, is that we don't necessarily incentivize the right behaviors that are based upon, like you say, is there a risk in here? Well, if I'm taking this risk, it's on my head if this goes wrong, right? So I think that a lot of organizations are quite stuck when it comes to that calculated risk taking. It's easier to do a thing that I've always done than it is to try something else. So I think that that's definitely something that's a bias inherently in a lot of the cultures. I think that what's also really interesting is around like actually the time spent in that period where we think about and we design. I think there's quite a drive to get that first patient, first visit in, right? And we don't necessarily, it's one is generating the information, and then two is with that information and those insights, how do we produce action on those, right? And I think that that's where an area I see that sometimes gets lost is that we do a great job of analyzing it, but we become so paralyzed sometimes by the amount of data. We sit and say, well, actually, what do we do with this? And sometimes it's easier just to revert to type rather than actually trying something else. And as you say, being in a position to, you can always monitor and assess that and then change the dial and say, okay, we got this wrong. But effectively, we're looking at that, better protocol design, saves those amendment times. There's 5-6 amendments in some, phase 3, they take 3 months to implement, cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and effectively elongate the program. So I think that more work that we do upfront on insight and actually how do we action those insights, I think is coupled with the cultural aspects is vital.
Yeah, Yeah, sometimes just having more data just gives you, sort of analysis paralysis. And certainly when we're looking at surveys and things, one of the challenges I often put to people is say, well, write down what the number would have to look like for you to change a decision that you've made. Like, write that down before we collect the data. And often people are very hesitant to do that because they just want to see pictures. And unfortunately, when humans see pictures, and they tell stories, and that's not always helpful because we all bring our own history to that. So yeah, so I've got two more questions sort of from the archive, and then we'll sort of throw it out. So I want to ask a specific question to both of you about pediatrics. So as we talk about safety, as we talk about difficult sort of areas, as we talk about some of the different challenges, maybe you could comment a little bit about the suitability of these approaches for different populations in a pediatric setting, because clearly we have issues with, say, getting consent or assent from minors right at the beginning of the study. We also know adherence or compliance for various data collection can be very challenging. And of course, our population is growing and changing and and developing over the time. So over the course of a trial, some might go from an infant to a child to an adolescent, right? So those needs are changing. I was wondering if you had any experiences there or any best practices, because it seems like quite a key population. Speaking as a parent, I ain't taking my kids down to a hospital if I can do it from home. So yeah, what hope is there for me that if we ever need to, that the pediatrics will be an area where this is useful?
That's a great question. And I think you raised some very important points as we think about age of consent, age of assent. We have to first make sure that our electronic consent platforms understand that there will be variability in state by state and country by country requirements as relates to age of consent and assent. And even in the United States, we don't have a consistent age across the country and need to anticipate that age has to be a configuration that needs to be established. I think we have to embrace digital functionality and gaming elements without oversimplifying or make trite the important and serious nature of what's at hand. I think that our engagement strategies, to your point, need to be dynamic, meaning that as you were pointing out, in the case of, say, a gene therapy, where I might be looking to follow a person for 8, 10, 12 years, the person I'm enrolling may be a child. And during that span of that study, they may become an adolescent, a teenager, a young adult, an adult. And obviously the expectations and ways to engage with them need to evolve and mature just as they are. And again, we might find that there may be some interesting dynamics around choice and flexibility to give people the tools to engage that are right for them. I've got over my shoulder a fun stuffed animal that a friend had shared with me at a couple of recent conferences, but it's also a great example in that this guy's got some codes on his paws to help children to be able to learn and engage when they're receiving medical care. This guy over here has diabetes. And so as your child is navigating, taking readings and understanding glucometers and understanding when to dose, he's learning on it through augmented reality with his stuffed animal who shares that condition. Now, obviously, that's going to work for one age range, but that child is going to grow up, and we have to be keeping our approaches dynamic and fresh along the way.
That's amazing. I hadn't heard of that, and actually, one of the challenges of being in trials of medicine, you actually don't have something physical or instantiated, particularly if it's something like an injection or an infusion. Even as an adult, I wouldn't mind the idea of some sort of little tchotchke that I keep around and reminds me and allows me access, right? And so, I think maybe some of the rituals that were embedded in traditional sites of sitting on benches and seeing the doctor and someone listening to your chest, maybe we need to take that in a different direction. I hadn't even thought of augmented reality. That's brilliant. Great.
Yeah, I think as well, just touching on that, is that it's also around the network around the child, right? So looking at parents, it's things like, are they going through the same learning journey as well? How do we actually educate them and things like that? So I think that, again, it's taking that the child in this instance is the center, but there is a network that surrounds them, and it's how we actually educate and grow with both groups. So as an example, we've done stuff at Sano where, again, looking at a pediatric population and this idea of elongating over time, is that actually how do we educate and teach the parents about these conditions as they're going through this in the first instance, so that they are, and then how do you create networks within those patient within the patient, the carers, and so on and so forth, so there's that support. So I think that it's looking at the problem holistically as we possibly can, to engage and support the family effectively around that.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. And I suppose, maybe the same model could be applied for other caregivers as well. I suppose things that work well there could be very useful. I remember did a survey in motor neuron disease, and I was wrong when I assumed how many people, 55 to 70 would be married and have a spouse that they lived with. I guess from my lived experience, it would be more than half or whatever, and it was something like a third in this sample. And so often we're sort of saying, oh, well, someone else will push you to the hospital, somebody else will administer your, but well, there isn't always a someone else, or not someone that's consistently available. So challenging those assumptions is really key. So yeah. One of the things we saw, as we've already alluded to during COVID, was people sort of moving heaven and earth, and so many people who may not consider themselves patients being vaccine participants, for example, and getting so much more engaged in research. I was interested to read from a couple of years ago a statement by Scott Gottlieb talking about some of the lack of innovation in clinical trials. A little bit like what you were saying earlier, Craig. It wasn't for a lack of invention, and he said, unfortunately, we've seen a continued reluctance to adopt innovative approaches amongst sponsors and CROs because the business model adopted by the clinical trial establishment just isn't compatible. And certainly, in the UK, we've seen some of the decentralized and platform trials kind of, quietening down a bit just recently. So, if we all agree that DCT has a lot of promise, how would we know if the old system was actually sort of clawing it all back? And how would we raise the alarm to go, actually, as a society, we don't want that to happen? Just because someone used to get paid by filling out a piece of paper and then paying someone else to check the piece of paper and then paying someone else to check their checking. How do we go, okay, but that was before, that was in the before times. We're going to move on.
I think about that picture of what was it, George W. Bush on the deck of a battleship with a mission accomplished banner hanging overhead, and how it was probably even a year ago that I remember, people saying that this is our new normal. This is now how we do things going forward. And I just thought, ooh, it is way too early to call anything the new normal. There are things that large organizations have to do to create a new normal. We have a change management process. That change management is not free. It doesn't come just because we did it once differently. It doesn't come just because an organization leader says, yeah, we should be doing more of this. It comes because we make an investment. We review and update our SOPs and training. We identify gaps in our vendors and partners and fill those. We're changing our templates for, say, our protocol language. We're incentivizing and supporting our colleagues who embrace those new approaches. These are just some of the many attributes of what a change management effort internally looks like. I often think about it as, if we were going to change a system used internally in my pharma company, our trial master file, we're going to switch to a new eTMF. Well, we'd go out and hire Accenture or BCG or Deloitte, and they'd embed a team of colleagues. And I'd probably have a bunch from my own organization that are fully committed to that. And we put a date on the calendar for a switch to happen, and somebody would be accountable, so that if that switch happened or didn't, we would know who to either celebrate or point our fingers at. These are what change looks like. It doesn't come free. And if we want to make sure we don't slide back, we have to see those commitments. And fortunately, Paul, we are starting to see those just in the last year. Large and mid-sized organizations that are making those types of commitments internally, and it matters and it shows, and it definitely gives me more confidence that we won't start to slip backward. But there are so many forces that will pull us backward. A sniff or a whiff of regulatory concern, seeing high profile mistakes being made because somebody rushed down a certain pathway, ambiguity from regulators, or just the economic incentive that The guy in the office down the hall did it the old way, and he still has a job here. And so why should I do things differently? Right? We have to fix those incentives and support our colleagues.
Yeah, and I think if we look back and say, okay, how long has change taken in the industry? And I think there's this hype, right, in which that we say, okay, this new thing is going to revolutionize, and it usually takes 15 years or so to embed in the industry. There's a lot of, Craig's point, change management around that, behavioral change that's a function. And I think that's just an element of the industry and as individuals. I think what's super interesting is that with this change, that I think COVID has been a great innovator for the industry as a whole with this, and I'm hoping that this helps us speed up that process as opposed to that 15-year innovation cycle. It's maybe we can take it down to 8 years or something like that, but it is going to take time.
One of the things I've noticed throughout my career is that sometimes when you're trying to change something, it sometimes helps to kind of jump up a level and kind of see what pressures are coming down on people. And so one of the angles I'm hoping might work is some of the FDA and senior funders and senior publishers' emphasis on inclusion and diversity of trial participants. And so for me, one of the questions would be, if all these people, especially FDA, are saying, look, you have to have a plan for how all your participants are not just going to be, white, hyper-educated, wealthy people living in Boston and San Francisco or something. Show me that plan. My hope is, and interested in your comments, that decentralization could help that, because from from multiple different dimensions, I suspect that all the barriers we've just discussed impact, various minority groups much more, and particularly where there's intersectionality of those different groups, maybe they don't speak English as a first language, and they're shift worker and only parent, all these kinds of things. Surely those can only be worse for the types of show up at the hospital at 10 a.m. on a bus type situations we talked about. So is that a useful pull through that is evergreen and we can rely on? Have you seen people reacting to that? Have you seen that as a driver, or am I being optimistic?
Well, certainly when we look at pieces of bipartisan legislation in the U.S., like the Diverse Trials Act, like the DEPICT Act, that both are targeting improving diversity and representation in research, they both call out decentralized trials and making sure that there's guidance and clarity to drive and incent adoption. Decentralized is a great enabler of representation where geography is a barrier, where physical distance is a barrier, but where we have marginalized communities that lack trust, decentralized is a dish best served paired. And we need to make sure that companies and sponsors are not just looking at decentralization as a silver bullet, but something that really needs to go along with efforts to restore faith, trust, and confidence in communities that have been marginalized for so long. Now, the thing that I worry about here, Paul, is decentralized. I am at a point of believing it is going to outlast the pandemic. I see these commitments that organizations are making, and it's something that they can control and manage, even though it does require regulators and sites to come along. I think there's strong signals of support. Diversity initiatives, I do worry about, because that's not a quick, decentralized, it's funny to position that as a quick fix, but relative to the pace of change in pharma, it is relatively quick. It's manageable. Addressing diversity and inclusion, there is not a quick fix for. This is a long-term investment in restoring faith and trust and confidence. And I do worry about industry's ability to commit to a long-term investment that will require years to start to see true meaningful change. And so I am cautious in my belief that some of those diversity efforts will really stick around in earnest. Guidance from FDA, encouraging plans are good. Carrots and sticks tend to be the things that drive change.
Yeah. I've forgotten that actually when I read regulatory documents, I must look for words like must and that should sounds like shrug, right?
Show me. Well, let's put it this way. You've worked in rare for so long. You mentioned peds earlier. What drives rare disease drug development, pediatric drug development for so long? It was the incentives that were created from a regulatory perspective in terms of extensions around exclusivity, and that helped to catalyze and get past so much inertia that was there. If regulators were enabled through policy to offer extended exclusivity for sponsors who generate evidence that shows efficacy and safety in representative populations, in diverse subpopulations, people would make the investments and make this work, right? The right carrots can drive those behaviors. If people felt their submission timeline would be jeopardized for lack of representation, sticks also make the system work.
Yeah, I suppose in my techno-utopian version there, you know, the person who can't make those appointments has got an app that works in her language and the technology just works and there aren't 6 different passwords to log into. But, you know, you raise a good point. And I remember just anecdotally hearing, for example, I think one of the early vaccine tracking apps for the experimental groups in the UK was only on iPhone. I mean, that's the easiest way to cut off anyone that doesn't want to buy a £1,000 supercomputer every September, right? So, you know, there's a lot of could on this potential, but yeah, and I suppose going back to what you said, Craig, it's a toolbox of things, right? Because actually, slap it in an app is actually not the only tool in that toolbox. It might be, well, actually, there's a local community care centre where everyone gets their primary care. Let's engage there, right? So decentralization doesn't have to mean gadgets, I guess, is one of the messages you're conveying.
And I think, Paul, to that point, we have to look at this through, I think that, you know, as an industry, we don't necessarily have that technical wherewithal to understand the capabilities of technology, but we also have to look at it from a behavioral change or behavioral science perspective to say, actually, how do we balance plus other things that we can look and say, actually, what is the best solution? Because it may not be a technology, it may be some form of, like, you know, outreach, communication, support for particular, you know, patient groups and so on and so forth. So again, it all comes down to me to that design piece in which we sit down and we look at the problem holistically and we really focus on, okay, what is the problem we're trying to solve here, and make sure we're clear about that, gather enough information to take action on it. Because, you know, the reality is that, you know, adding more technology for the sake of it is not a solution. It only complicates things and, you know, putting the wrong solution to the wrong problem. So
yeah, and actually there's a question here about asking whether or not sites are actually getting that necessary visual information, say in the form of alerts and data, to really allow them to take care of the participants that they're responsible for. Do you think are those tools baked in, or is it very much just kind of capture the data goes into a hole, make sure it's neat and tidy on the way in?
I think people have an obligation to make sure that sponsors have access to data and information, but is it timely? Is it easy? Is it alert driven? Is it integrated for them? Or are they being asked to log into a bunch of disconnected systems? Is there a lag and latency as we're waiting for a visiting nurse to get their visit updated into the right system and pushed over to the other systems so that reconciliation and alerts could be triggered? I don't think it is quite as seamless and effortless as it needs to be. I think there's still plenty of room for optimization there.
It's also interesting that, you know, if you are logging more data, right, as, you know, heart rate as a simple, and you're doing that 24/7, you know, expect more alerts than when a patient is just visiting site and you're checking their heart rate, right? So I think that there's like these checks and balances that need to be in place, but it's a case of like at what extent do we do that? So there needs to be a balance. The amount of data that we're collecting on each clinical trial is just increasing exponentially over the last, you know, years. And I think it's about being mindful about what exactly do we sort of report on and what do we not.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. All right. Well, look, I'm so glad we've gone into some depth on these topics, because I think so often I see some of the same talking points about, oh, it'll all be great, it'll all be terrible. And I think it's been great to have someone with real, or two people with real expertise that can sort of drill down and so give the audience a lot of tips and insights. For people that want to drill further, the DTRA that Craig mentioned earlier has got a wealth of resources, and you can see the types of organizations that can be involved there. Obviously, as Liam was talking about earlier, some of the work we do at Sano is very much about trying to find this precision group of people. I'm personally, as a rare nerd, very interested in the genetic aspects. I really feel like unraveling the genetic aspects of conditions like cystic fibrosis is a great model that we can follow in lots of other conditions. So, it's been very exciting to see that. But yeah, both Liam and Craig are eminently followable on podcasts, clubhouses, Twitters, I don't know, books, TV. Don't know if you're going to be on Oprah anytime soon, the two of you. But please do check them out online, and you'll find a ton of other great content resources. But thanks so much for sharing your insights, sharing your experiences. It's been a great discussion, and thank you to everyone else for joining us today.
Thanks, Paul. Bye.
Pleasure.